Morning. It's pissing down in Cornwall today, middle of the holiday season. Look at it. Look at that grey sky. Anyway, I'm still thinking about fundamentalism, so if you're bored of this topic, turn away now. But I'm thinking about the relationship between fundamentalists and poetics. And my contention would be that, just in, like I said in the previous video, that fundies don't like uncertainty. Fundies also don't like poetry. And I need to qualify that. I put a caveat in the last one, I'm going to put a caveat in this one. Of course, there's going to be lots of fundies out there who say, I love poetry, I've got a collection of poetry on my shelf. I listen to Ginsberg and I listen to T.S. Eliot and I read these books. I love poetry. But my guess is that those same fundies will deny that there's anything poetic about their thinking. They may well say, yeah, I'm not much of a poet myself, I don't know much about art, but I know what I like. That kind of a relationship. Because one of the aspects of the fundamentalist mindset, as I see it, is a harsh distinction that they draw between the literal and the poetic, or the literal and the metaphorical, the literal and the analogical. Things that are real and things that are made up, things that are flights of fancy in the language, and language which is plain. And you'll come, well, I certainly have come across lots of those kind of references. The people who I'm talking about. And again, this spreads right across the atheist, theist, right across the spectrum of religious affiliations. People who want language to be plain, who want to have that, who would be revolted by the idea that language is something that mutates over time. They'll go to the dictionary a lot for their meanings. They'll insist that their meanings of words are correct. They'll be very kind of bound up on the idea that not only that words should have absolute meanings that we all absolutely agree upon, and those absolute meanings should be in a book somewhere, the dictionary, but also that these words are kind of firm objects. It's a little bit like that. It's the same metaphor playing itself out at the level of language, I think. That language is a set of firm building blocks. And if you express yourself really, really rigidly and correctly and put those things down, then you can build on them. That seems to be one of the mindsets. We know that this isn't true, by the way. I mean, language is kind of my thing, but certainly natural language, the stuff that I'm using right now, just words, or anything but that. They're very volatile, very mutable, do change a lot, not just over time, but also in the course of a single utterance. I can say a word at the beginning of this sentence, it would mean something completely different. By the end of the sentence, I can reverse meanings just by putting an A at the beginning of them, or putting a knot at the beginning of it. And I can tie those words up in knots by putting them in different orders. And I'm not being deliberately obfuscatory. That's in the nature of language. But if you're a fundamentalist, in language terms, you won't believe that. Because you have a need for certainty, and part of that certainty manifests itself in a need for a clear expressibility of language. And words like clear are going to be part of that vocabulary that you're attached to. Clear, well-bounded, firm, all those kind of things I've spoken about before. So because of that, you'll believe that there's a way of expressing oneself which is clear, and there are poetic ways which are not clear, which are the opposite of firm, cloudy, spacey, mushy, fluffy, poetic, all that kind of stuff. You'll have an attachment to the literal, you'll associate the literal with true, and you'll be disparaging, or at least condescending, towards modes of expression which you think are not literal. Now, as I say, that isn't the case. We know that natural language, the stuff that I'm speaking now and that we all speak on these videos, isn't like that. There might be some claim that specialist languages, the language of analytical logic or the language of mathematics, might have more claim to more stability, although there's pretty good evidence that even that is a result of poetic processes, albeit highly structured, highly interpersonally negotiated, regulated poetic processes, which is fine. But certainly this stuff, the stuff that I'm using now, is all over the place. I'm constantly building castles in the sky in my imagination and projecting these out. And you think these castles are solid because they're forming these images, but they're really not. So this thing about literalness and the metaphorical, because of this, I think, if you're a fundamentalist in the way that I've been talking about it, you will have that attachment to language, and you will think that every other form of expression, and particularly something like metaphor and analogy, is, as I say, obfuscatory and a kind of a lie, a kind of possibly even willful attempt to distract. So I'm just going to turn around because there's another dog coming. Possibly you might even see this that I'm doing now as a kind of willful attempt to distract from the fundamental truth of what you hold to be fundamentally true in the basement of your imagination. So something comes out of that, and the one thing that comes out of that for me, I think, is that on some level, you'd probably say this if you're a fundamentalist, you won't recognise that what we're doing here is trading in metaphors. This idea, and I've heard this expressed, this idea that the whole idea of fundamentalism is a metaphor, that it's part of a metaphor to do with something like building, the construction or the growth of something from the ground up, you know, whether that be a tree metaphor in which the roots are considered the foundation, the fundamentals, or whether it be a building metaphor in which the foundations of the house or the foundations of the building are considered the fundamentals, or whether it be a kind of building metaphor in which one places one stone on top of another, like the cairn I've talked about, in which the stones at the bottom, the hardest, largest, most fixed stones, the fundamentals. Whichever building metaphor you use, you probably won't recognise it as a metaphor. You would probably dismiss that. There should be a word for this, a bit like Dunning-Kruger effect. You know, the Dunning-Kruger effect says that people who are stupid don't know they're stupid, essentially. An equivalent of this in metaphorical terms would be, you know, people who use fundamentalist metaphors don't know that they're using metaphors, and so that they would be they'd have a low tolerance for that idea. They would want to believe that their fundamental truths were the literal truths, literal in the sense that the words mean exactly what they say they mean. Those words are rock solid, just like their truths are rock solid. It becomes a kind of self-fulfilling vicious circle of metaphorical understanding. It clearly isn't the case, and in some ways it's a bit of a shame really, because other models of knowledge which don't rely on building or growth metaphors are really helpful. And you don't need to go to religious or spiritual or anything like that ideas to do that. A lot of knowledge does work through kind of mapping processes. Mapping metaphors are really prevalent in some knowledge production, particularly what's sometimes called erudition. That's a term from Pascal Boyer, the anthropologist. I'll talk about that separately, I think. But ways of knowing the world and knowing experience via mapping processes, for example, is an alternative. And if you're locked into a model of knowledge creation which is all about building and you have access to the fundamentals, then you'll never get the knowledge as a map metaphor. Or there's ecological metaphors for knowledge, in which knowledge kind of grows and shifts over time and is context dependent, and the growth of one part of your epistemology is related to the overall ecology in which your knowledge is forming itself, and you kind of have to come to that kind of knowledge with a different mindset, and that wouldn't be available to you again if you're locked into a fundamentalist understanding of knowledge and building is your only metaphor. In fact, again, you would regard this as poetic nonsense, because you're incapable of seeing the metaphor because of your fundamentalist attachment to the literal. Literal's a great word. I'm going to talk about literal at another point. So overall, just to see if I can round that off, what I'm saying is that if you're a fundamentalist in the way that I'm using it right now, and I want to stress again that being fundamentalist isn't always bad, having the idea that knowledge is a building or knowledge is something that grows, having that in your vocabulary of understanding isn't bad, it's a good thing to have. Understanding that those kind of things need firm foundations is not bad. It's only when it's misapplied that it's bad. But if you are one of those people who can't recognise other forms of knowledge, then you just might be a fundie, a fundamental literalist. 10 minutes.